It's hard to pin down exactly when the first open world game was made, but to me, there is one title that stands out amongst all the potential candidates. The first entry in one of gaming's most iconic series, The Legend of Zelda. While open world gameplay was starting to become more commonplace within adventure games by its release in 1984, Zelda still felt like it broke new ground in a number of ways. It was an open world crafted in unison with every other element of the game. Players would progress through the game's 8 core dungeons in whichever order they wanted, finding weapons and items as they did so. Except these dungeons could be approached in any order, and those weapons and items could be used to uncover secret entrances to later dungeons. Put simply, they made one of the first shining examples of an open-ended, unstructured approach to open world design that gave players a phenomenal amount of freedom while keeping them on the path to victory. Surely it was a philosophy that was going to stick, right? Well, no, of course not. I mean, we've played games like Driver 3 or Mass Effect Andromeda. Instead, in the light of garbage fires like them, the interesting question soon becomes, where did things go wrong? Over the last few years, more and more games have employed certain tactics to create open worlds that feel, to use the industry's 2 favorite buzzwords, dynamic and emergent. But they've yet to truly manifest themselves across the board at the AAA level. In a market dominated by annualized open world franchises, games have become increasingly homogenized, defined by cut and paste mechanics that distract us from the exploration that should be at the core of game design. Interesting towers to climb that promptly barf icons all over the map, RPG-ifying mechanics to turn potentially dynamic systems into a series of mundane tasks, making gamers aware of every point of interest, rewarding every interaction, marking it all down in a quest log, and allowing you to fast travel there and back again. It's all in the service of an open world that occupies your attention, but is ultimately hollow. It may be an industry-wide phenomenon, but read between the lines and you're soon left with a clearer picture of where the blame might lie. It's the story of one publisher and their tower-climbing, animal-skinning franchise that formed the mold for all the cookies yet to be cut. This is Game Changers, and this is how Far Cry 3 ruined open world games. 3D open world games might have been expensive, complex and taxing on hardware when they started to pop up in the late 90s, but they also opened up a door for an unrivaled level of freedom. What if, rather than just creating a fully explorable environment to house a game, developers took things even further? What if they created a city filled with NPCs, each with their own routines and sense of autonomy? What if they implemented a day-night cycle, an overwhelming amount of voice acting, a weather system? Predictably, with so much possibility on offer, the industry's next big trendsetter in open world design wasn't far behind. In 2001, Rockstar released the groundbreaking Grand Theft Auto 3 to critical acclaim, with studio co-founder Dan Houser openly citing Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time as major influences. GTA 3 took the open-ended gameplay of the other entries in the series and brought them into an extraordinarily detailed 3D world. The game's NPCs genuinely felt dynamic, as the way you interacted with them had a tangible impact on the environment. Sure, for most players this amounted to just killing them, but this still counts. It was an open world that, like Zelda's, rewarded exploration. New vehicles and weapons could be found off the beaten track and taken into future missions. GTA 3 might have had far more complex story to tell than Nintendo's titles, but there was still innovation in how they did it. The balance between narrative design and an unstructured open world had been struck in a sandbox that seemed to have never-ending possibilities. With rave reviews and over 14 million units sold worldwide, Grand Theft Auto 3 remains one of the most influential games of all time. GTA 3 didn't just create a template that other developers could replicate to achieve their own successes with open world games, it financially incentivized them to do so by outlining just how big the market for those experiences could be. It wasn't long before nobody was safe from the temptation to follow in GTA's footsteps. Rockstar had created a blueprint that was ready to be copied time and time again. Adapting a classic movie like Scarface or The Godfather, make it a GTA clone. Working with children's licenses like Lego or The Simpsons, GTA clone. GTA in London, GTA in Asia, GTA with a cop, GTA with cowboys. Wait, scratch that last one. I mean, but you get the picture though. Whether you were reinventing a key franchise or trying to create an entirely new one, gamers had a thirst for open worlds that never appeared to get quenched. What once was a tool used sparingly to elevate a game's design was beginning to feel like something of a necessity and an alluring prospect for any publisher. Well, almost any publisher. Ubisoft, whose name you've been waiting to hear since you saw the title of this video, did a surprisingly good job of resisting that urge. A quick glimpse at their major releases from 2001 onwards showed how they largely stayed true to the roots of their marquee franchises and original IP. Beyond Good and Evil, Prince of Persia, and 13 represented just some of Ubisoft's continued commitment to the genres at the core of their design. That's not to say that Ubisoft didn't have any open world properties, they just never appeared to show interest in the blueprint Rockstar had laid out for them. Far Cry, for example, was a traditional first-person shooter set within an open world, but one that was far more concentrated than other games for the era. Players still had a large environment to navigate as they traveled between objectives, but they were never distracted with the promise of side missions or other gameplay elements. It made Far Cry a game that included an open world, but wasn't defined by it. This commitment to a vision remained true for many future releases as well, especially 2007's Assassin's Creed. Being a third-person action-adventure game set in an open world, it was, in some respects, the closest thing to a GTA clone that Ubisoft had made at the time. By applying new mechanics to the potentially generic formula, both in terms of gameplay and narrative, they ensured they made a game that stood out. Traversal, for example, was groundbreaking for the time, implementing a free-form parkour system that allowed players to climb almost any wall or building, and seamlessly move from rooftop to rooftop. Perhaps more importantly though, there was the way Ubisoft decided to break up the delivery of the open world. While extremely popular, a lot of the games we've discussed thus far were also a little bit daunting. Giving players a seemingly unlimited amount of options for how to progress through a game sometimes brought about the opposite reaction to what was intended. It scared them into taking the simplest route possible. To counter the issue, Ubisoft came up with a way to drip feed the information. Cities would be broken up into sections, each one masked by a fog of war. Players would be required to find the tower in each part of the map, scale it, and synchronize from the top, giving them a clear view of the area and all the activities that could be completed within it. Why overwhelm a player and risk them missing out on content made for the game when you could guide them through your world piece by piece and give them an opportunity to interact with every corner of the open world? It was the kind of approach Ubisoft was consistently taking with their games. They were happy to iterate on well-worn design in the quest for a new experience. This thinking didn't just apply to the opening installments of their franchises either. Far Cry 2 and Assassin's Creed 2 are games that both, for my money, represent near perfect examples of video game iteration. Every rough edge present in their predecessors had been smoothed over, and every mechanic had been tweaked to perfection. All of this is to say that Ubisoft cared. They didn't have a flawless reputation at the time, and nor did they deserve one. After all, in the gap between Far Cry and Far Cry 2, they managed to ship Winnie the Pooh's Rumbly Tumbly Adventure and 7 different entries in the Pet series, and that's Pets with a Z. Making money was always at the core of Ubisoft's game plan, but when you look at the care they took with the core franchises during this era, you got the feeling that they genuinely wanted to do right by them. Household names like Splinter Cell, Rayman, and Prince of Persia resisted the urge to force out new entries prematurely, and sequels validated their existence with meaningful improvements. Then, somewhere around 2009, things started to change, and not for the better. As development costs rose and the battle for supremacy in the sales race became even tougher, a swathe of what you might call B games got swept aside. Audiences no longer seemed interested in mediocre games attached to high-profile licenses as consumers started spending their money more wisely. This was the credit crunch after all, where once there was evidence that Ubisoft strived for innovation and genuine improvement in their sequels, it was now hard to see their intent beyond the financial bottom line. Their once treasured marquee titles now had to act as their new cash cows. Over 2 years separated Assassin's Creed and Assassin's Creed 2, but in the 6 years that followed the latter title, Ubisoft would go on to release 8 more, and it wasn't long before the franchise began to tread water. In the midst of all this chaos came Far Cry 3. Anything would have felt like a breath of fresh air at the time, given the speed at which the Assassin's Creed series had jumped the shark, but Far Cry 3 was a genuinely phenomenal game. Here was a sequel that had been in development for a number of years and was making changes to directly address the issues of the games that had come before it. While Assassin's Creed 3, released just a month prior, had become the first game in the series to suffer at the hands of tedium with a Metacritic score of 84, everything looked pretty dandy on Planet Far Cry, but by this point I'm sure you know what's coming next. Far Cry 3's 4-year development cycle was a mere anomaly, a remnant of the old Ubisoft. Once the game hit shelves, the franchise was saddled with the same agenda as Assassin's Creed: churn and burn. If you want the clearest indication of just how shitty things got for Far Cry, look no further than this year's offering, New Dawn, currently rocking a whopping 71 on Metacritic. If Far Cry and Assassin's Creed ended up being nothing more than poster boys for the dangers of annualization, we'd all be better off for it. But unfortunately, our story doesn't end there. In truth, there was something more sinister bubbling away beneath the surface. Something that didn't just have an impact on these two series, but in time plagued the entire industry. With their once reliable licensed properties no longer bumping up their numbers, Ubisoft needed their remaining franchises to perform, and to do so as often as possible. They needed annualization. After this realization, it wasn't long before one of Assassin's Creed's biggest innovations soon got twisted into something far more sinister. Cordoning off parts of an open world and steering players in the direction you want them to take was a genius way to ensure that each sandbox opened up in a natural way. Over time, it became clear, however, that this was a great way to ensure players only saw the parts of the world that you wanted them to see. Climb a tower, reveal an area, let the game tell you what to do in it, and then move on. It was a shift that sucked the exploration out of these open world titles. Fetch quests, collectibles, outposts, everything became an icon that was promptly spewed onto the map with each tower you climbed. Now, I'll admit that something doesn't quite add up here. I mean, if these criticisms are true of every Ubisoft game since and including Far Cry 3 and Assassin's Creed 2, then why were they so well received? Well, Ubisoft didn't just shit out a cookie-cutter formula for designing open worlds, they also updated the systems that sat alongside them with the video game equivalent of crack. They RPGified the shit out of everything. To the untrained eye, a progress bar can look deceptively boring. To anyone that's ever been hooked on an RPG before, it immediately becomes a challenge. Nothing makes the idea of climbing another tower more appealing than the game reminding you of how many you have left to climb. Better yet, provide the player with some additional XP for each time they topple that landmark, and they're now that much closer to leveling up and learning a new skill. This was one of the key things that Far Cry 3 understood about how its open world was structured. Most gamers, when presented with a challenge, will pursue it. Look at Far Cry 3's wildlife system, for example. Remarkably deep and complex, the open world hosted everything from jaguars to sharks, each with its own AI. It seems like the kind of system that would be tailor-made for dynamic interactions and emergent gameplay. Except it wasn't. How did the majority of players interact with Far Cry 3's ecosystem? They killed the exact number of animals required to craft the next upgrade and moved on. It's the perfect example of how the systems Ubisoft created alongside their open worlds actively distracted us from how little we were truly interacting with them. With each passing entry, critics and players alike became more aware of the issue. The idea of the dreaded Ubisoft Tower was being openly discussed, and the popularity of the games was beginning to dwindle, but not before the rest of the industry could take note. Public perception of the ideas Ubisoft had stirred up might have been shaky, but boy oh boy did it look tempting to the other developers. What followed was years and years of open world titles, each giving a nod to the lessons Ubisoft had learned. Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor, infamous Second Son, Mad Max, Dying Light, Batman Arkham Knight, even titles as recent as Rage 2 and Days Gone. The list of games that were clearly influenced by Ubisoft shortcuts is seemingly never ending. Even their own titles such as Watch Dogs, The Division and The Crew bore the scars of what's sure to be remembered as one of the most disappointing eras in open world game design. I mean, at least I hope it's an era. With games still being released in 2019 that appear to share the same DNA, it's impossible to satisfyingly close the case on this issue. It's clear they've done major and in some cases irreparable harm to their reputation and the reputations of their games, but can the same be said of the wider industry? Fortunately, I don't think it can. While Ubisoft's trajectory between 2009 and 2016 continued to nosedive, we'd be doing the industry a disservice if we failed to acknowledge that there were genuinely phenomenal achievements being made in open world games parallel to this timeline. Bethesda's open world titles came on leaps and bounds. CD Projekt Red's The Witcher series featured some of the best writing I've ever seen in so-called side content. Even the Mac Daddy of the modern open world game Rockstar blessed us with GTA 5. Ubisoft themselves have even begun to show signs that they have acknowledged their own mistakes. Assassin's Creed took a year off and returned looking better than ever with Assassin's Creed Origins, while Watch Dogs has avoided the annualization treatment and seems to be coming up with genuinely unique concepts for the open world space. So look, yes, the years following 2008 were a difficult time for all developers and publishers. A financial crisis had an unprecedented impact on the way publishers had to make games and how many people would buy them. The licensed game market soon collapsed, all while development costs continued to skyrocket. They either had to think on their feet or risk losing it all. Ubisoft rolled the dice, and while we may not look back on it particularly fondly, they probably remember it as one of the eras that secured their future in the industry. Now, even Ubisoft themselves are drifting away from the mold that they created. It's clear that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, as a new wave of titles get ready to show us what the future could look like. Whether it's the expansive, procedurally generated worlds of Minecraft and No Man's Sky, or Red Dead Redemption 2's scarily detailed sandbox, we've already seen where that innovation could come from next. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, even a few years removed from its launch alongside the Nintendo Switch, is a title that still feels like a breath of fresh air. It was a game that spent its opening hour introducing you to its world, how it could be manipulated, and all the powers you needed to do so. What followed was an open-ended adventure filled with dynamic, unstructured gameplay and emergent storytelling, all driven by the player. Thankfully, these are the games that allow us to leave this issue on a positive note. In spite of Ubisoft's slip-ups, more and more games are displaying a true understanding of why these playgrounds were made to begin with. After a generation of crawling in the dark, the video game industry looks primed to return to open worlds that allow emergent gameplay to, well, re-emerge.